Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another session of training on development of resilient transport infrastructure in Africa. This is module 4.2. It's titled Concept and Concepts of Public-Private Partnership, PPP. Like it is the tradition of my presentation, I always give a summary at the beginning. In this module, we have introduction, principles and concepts of PPP, private sector participation issues, factors success of overall PPP management, the concept of PPP in its generic acceptance. In code, this is a set of possible contractual forms aimed at private sector participation, PSP, in the financing, construction, and or operation of a public infrastructure service. The principles and concepts of PPP, we always start by understanding this principle with a question: why call on the private sector to manage public infrastructure? The reasons and basic answers to this is that number one, based on not of more in more crucial of finder credible technical partners to support the development, based of more in more crucial of finders of services of additional funding, need for government to refocus and concentrate their effort on sovereignty activities. This will lead us to the partnership in public-private, which is an alternative to improve the quality of services, all in mastering the variations of costs and the sources funding for the state. PPPs are first and foremost part of an economic development and reform policy initiated by a state. The use of PPPs can help in one, greater flexibility of public budgets, even if a PPP cannot be summed up to the sole notion of a financing vehicle, and two, the optimization of public projects by adopting the best practices of private management, particularly in terms of improving the quality of services. The characteristics of a PPP, you can find such characteristics in this order from my presentation. The constraints of its implementation, where you have upstream rigorous planning during the setup phase, a strengthened capacity to understand the issues, especially for public officials, as well as adapted and transparent procedures, and two, downstreams, perfectly clear regulations and control methods between the different players. An assembly that is complex by nature, a multidimensional partnership bringing together public and private partners and customers, stroke service users who are priority, have conflicting interests, the wide variety of applicable contractual forms. There's no single model or standard solution. Each case is unique and can be characterized from the following questions. That is when you want to go into the PPP contractual agreement. Here you consider who pays for the service, the user within the framework of a concession with private payment, the taxpayer within the framework of a concession with public payment, mixed mode of remuneration, who bears the risk, who must fit into a coherent legal order. One, providing good feasibility regarding the PPP award and implementation procedure, and two, enabling the parties to monitor performance and reinforce compliance with contractual obligations. These are part of the principles and concepts of PPP. What is the scope of the activities that are entrusted or delegated to the private sector? Construction, exploitation, maintenance, and upkeep are all key indicators that must be factored or considered in. Who finances the assets? the private partner, the public partner, mixed financing. These are all conditions that must be clearly defined. Now, principles and concepts of PPP can be subdivided into different categories and order of engagement or agreement. You have the public-private partnership as the key thing that brings all the actors into it. Then you have the public sector who owns and operates the asset. The private sector also has its own part to play in owning and operating its own assets. You have restructuring of the public service transformation into a company, that is a decentralization. Then public work service contracts, management and operating contracts, localization affirmations, concessions, BOT projects, BOD projects, joint ventures, partial transfer of public asset, then total asset disposals. Then the aspect of public funding comes in now. Here, a combination of public and private fundings must come together. Entirely private funding or financing, you have low. Hearing of private sector participation, then on the private sector is always high. Sources. This presentation is sourced based on the definition of the World Bank's infrastructure, PPP Resource Center. Issues of contractual typology in the principles and concepts of PPP. One of the issues is that a very clear distinction must be made between public markets, public service delegation contracts known as private payment concession, service mainly, substantially borne by the users, and two, concessions with public payment, in other words, operation for which the remuneration of the private partner, rent or royalty, is essentially substantially borne by the public authorities, that is to say the state, local communities, or public establishment. Another issue there is that freedom contracts of the administration and the conditions of control and intervention of the public power must be substantially different, depending on whether it uses one of these three contractual forms. Then in same principles and concepts of PPP, the legal aspect is always there. And this, in our presentation, we refer to it as legal regimes with different forms of PPP. And the first step, we have public outsourcing modes. Then we go to public sector, immediate payment by the public sector, then payment over time by the public sector. Then we have a forward and back action, which is delegation of public service, including private payment concession, payment of the service by the user. Then we have the public paid concession, payment of the service by the public sector in the form of reimbursement or participation of the operator in the profits of the operation. We have, again, another presentation here where public authorities go into the PPP contracts, then the project company itself. The project company is now attached to the promoters of the project, the insurance, then the banks who finances, then the builders, and then the operators of the contract project at the end of it. The promoters are shareholders agreement. The public authorities are the PPP contract. The project company goes into, then the insurance insures the policies of operation. The banks does the credits or finance agreement. Then the builders are the construction contracts. And then the operators are those that will be like the end users or operating the contracts. We also have in the principles and concept of PPP to look at the long-term investment cycles. Now here, the first step is that the preparatory phase to show the opportunity and the feasibility of resorting to a PPP, states, places, and diagnosis of the existing, study market, which is traffic study, tariff study, analysis of investor strategies macroeconomic study, etc. Then study technical sizing. This is the study of investment costs, CAPEX, and summary investment project. That is the work and equipment, plus study of operating cost, OPEX. The impact study environment, the legal study and the institutional study of financial feasibility, that is the risk analysis, allocation or mitigation, study of economic feasibility, socioeconomic justification of the project. These are all part of the long-term investment cycles of the principles and concept of PPP. The confection of the business plan and contractual setup for the transaction. The second step, the private partner selection process. The organization of a call for tender procedure versus a competitive dialogue procedure. Here, one, regulation of the call for tender and in particular technical and financial selection criteria. Two, draft contract and annexes, including specification. That is the role in which the private partner selection process must pass through for a successful contractual agreement. The prospecting, communication, and organization of conferences with investors, that is the roadmap or road show. Here, the importance of project marketing is considered. This also involves the market as early as possible in the orientation of the project. The pre-selection, intermediate technical selection, and financial selection, and the final financial selection. Also, negotiation, restructuring of the financial engineering of the project, and finalization of the PPP contract with a successful tenderer. In doing this, letter of intent and information memorandum, that's memorandum of understanding or SOFT, must also be drawn. We have the negotiation of contractual clauses with promoters and financing conditions with lenders, term sheets and credit documentation. Financial closure, the financial closing. The third step is a phase after the entry into force of the partnership. Here, signature of the concessioning agreement and credit agreements must be considered. Entry into force of the partnership agreement. Technical completion of the project, which is the construction phase. Commissioning of the services, which is the operations phase. Reimbursement of credit, renegotiation, termination of the contract. These are all aspects that must be considered in the third phase of the long-term investment cycle of the principles and concepts of PPP. Duration, very different contracts according to the contractual form envisaged for the PPP and the sectors of activity concerned. In conclusion, the PPP is a partnership involving many economic actors committed over the long-term benefit and confronted with potentially antagonistic objectives. The challenges of participation from the private sector leads us to the development of PSP in the management of public infrastructure service. Here, we have to put into consideration the dynamism of the company at the service of the general interest by benefiting from the flexibility and efficiency of the private sector in terms of management and innovation. Then what attracts private funding sources in a way to minimize the impact of the necessary infrastructure development on the public budgets of states. Two, to focus public investment on other national priorities, security, education, health, and the environment, etc. The issues of private sector partnership participation is also a multi-dimensional issue. Here, the character multidimensional is inherent in this arrangement. The character usually antagonistic the objective sought by the various actors involved in these operations. A cycle of long-term investment referring to the questions of incompleteness contracts, the phenomenon information asymmetry resulting from the complex relationship between the different actors. The public partner. This term brings together a diverse number of actors such as the state, central administration and decentralized services, local communities, regulatory authorities, etc. The private partner, promoters or sponsors, operators, builders, banks, other financial institutions, insurers. The customer/service user, user price tax, etc., versus public purchaser removal contract. These are all challenges of participation of the private sector in PPP agreement. PPP mounts capital intensive. Privatization, an arrangement leading to a total or partial sale of existing public asset. Operations, BOU, which is build, own, operate. Arrangement leading to the realization of new projects, greenfield, entirely entrusted to the private sector. Semi-public company type operations, WIC or joint venture. Arrangement leading to an increase in the capital of an existing public company by issuing new shares. The issues of private sector participation in continuation. This leads to multiple contractual relationships possible. PPP months of an administrative nature. Here, concession or BOT type contract, build, operate, transfer. Arrangement where the financing of project asset is provided in whole or in part by the private sector. We distinguish such kind of approach in privately paid concession, where the customer is the end user of the services. Here, it is applicable to ports, airports, railway lines, toll motorway, drinking water distribution services, or electricity supply, etc. Many possible contractual relationships are: one, publicly paid concessions, where the customer is a public authority, independent electricity production projects, independent power producers or IPP, public lighting, prisons, water treatment plant, fictitious toll, motorway, hospitals, etc. Mixed concession arrangement, urban transport, sports facility, etc. Contracts of leasing, arrangement where the financing of the project asset is provided by the public entity and where only the operation of the services is delegated to the private sector. We also speak of operating contract, performance contract, FMH, interested management. Who are the actors with prioritized antagonistic objectives of the challenges of participation of private sector in PPP agreement? For the public partner, public service obligations, equal treatment, continuity of service, and adaptation or mutability of the service, plus sustainable development. For the private partner, risk management, plus satisfaction of the requirement of balance and financial profitability with regard to the capital employed. For the user of the service, they desire to be able to have the best possible service at the lowest cost. The issues of private sector participation. This is differentiated constraints according to the actors considered. Constraint number one, for the private partners. Here, management of constraint intrinsic to the activity is seen as business constraints equals to income risk. Settings equals to requests and prices. Long-term demand forecasting problem refers to risk of volume or traffic. And two, problem of evaluating the elasticity of demand with respect to price in the case of private payment concession. Technical and industrial constraint equals to risk of additional costs. Period of construction and or period of operation. Technological risk, performance and realization risk, risk of delay, supply risk. The constraints for the private partner, which is management of financial constraint, this gives room to or give rise to financial equilibrium constraints equals to financial risk of default. Cash balance constraint, liquidity risk. Operating equilibrium constraint, economic risk. Here, level of activity below break-even point is seen. Financial structure balance constraint, capacity of the project to support debt, especially in project financing type arrangements. Financial profitability constraints equals to minimum return requirement on invested capital. Cash flow analysis, free cash flows, differentiated financial profitability requirement according to the nature of the capital providers, promoters, builders, operator, infrastructure fund, and equity fund, and banks. The constraint for the private partner, management of financial equilibrium constrained through ratios, financial structure ratio, equity/equity plus debt, annual debt coverage rate. Management of financial profitability constraints through ratios, rate return on investment, rate internal profitability of the project, present value net of the project, ratio of investment coverage, back funds owned and shareholders, cash in, cash out, actuarial rate debt coverage, rate of return of invested capital, rate of profitability of economic asset, ratios of operational risk and global risk. Constraints for the public partner, development constraints. Here, develop access to public service, improve the quality of services, politics, economic. Budget constraints, priority in the allocation of public resources to health, education, security, etc. Budgetary constraints, public debt capacity, monetary constraint for PET, currency purchases, politics, budgetary, and monetary. Social constraints, implementation of acceptable pricing for users, the question of the restructuring of administrative staff, social policy without forgetting the constraints. Differentiated constraints according to the actors considered. Continuation. The constraint of the public partner, socio-economic justification, economic profitability of the project, reasoned decision whether or not to use a PPP. What are the expected objectives? Strong involvement of public authorities in the project. How to measure the economic profitability of a project? Differential cost, benefit analysis, solution with project versus in reference, solution with versus reference solution, measurement of cost, benefits in terms of economic value, positive and negative externalities, in addition to so-called market costs through benefits. But levels, economic profitability requirement differentiated according to the nature of the economic entity considered, state versus local authority, regions, municipalities, regional economic centers, etc. Most used economic profitability indicators, socioeconomic benefit equals to economic VAN, internal rate of return equals to economical sorting. Constraint number 3, the constraint for the client, public service access constraint. Conditions of access to the public service, case of disadvantaged population in developing countries. Principle of continuity of public service, equal treatment versus positive discrimination of service users. Performance constraints and quality of service offered. Quality of service meeting current safety standards, competitive performance level, search for the best quality, price constraints, acceptable and fair price level, social acceptability of prices, competitive price level, search for the lowest price. The issues here in conclusion and of very key to understanding the public-private partnership agreement is the challenges of PSP, which constitute a set of antagonistic constraints requiring a global management method. The search for a comprehensive solution that meets all the constraints identified as in engineering projects are risk management, engineering regulatory, risk management, financial engineering, technical engineering, social engineering, legal engineering, and institutional. These are all key points to take note in the search for a solution, for a global solution in identifying constraints in engineering project. What legal and institutional engineering points given the incompleted contracts? Determination of the contractual form and institutional structure for the project. Here, uncertain future, number one, how or what will the population, resources, and growth have changed? Which new standards will have come to modify the legal obligations? Two, how to ensure that the management of the service complies with public service objectives insofar as this notion remains vague. Three, in the event of a change in the context, how can you remain in control of changes to the contract and make adjustment with the operator? Cost of information retrieval. Difficulties for the public partners to define with private operator in an exhaustive and precise manner the expected objective of the service over a horizon of 10, 20, or 30 years. The principle of risk management. The actors involved in the project, according to the general principle, any identified risk is reduced, transferred, or allocated. A coherent and balanced risk allocation scheme, reducing the overall risk of the project involves seeking optimal allocation, a distribution of risk between public and private actors on the one hand, and between promoters and lenders on the other hand, must be based on an analysis aimed at spreading the risk on the one who can best assume them in the sense of which it is the job. Any risk identified by the private partner result in a corresponding remuneration requirement. The public partner therefore has every interest in limiting as much as possible the risk that it imposes on its private partner, either because the latter is not in position to manage them, or if the public sector is more willing to assume them at a lower cost. These are the principles of risk management that also explain the issues of private sector participation in PPP. The risks are shared between the various stakeholders involved in the project. These stakeholders are government and authorities, local and operators, sponsors and shareholders of the SPC, equipment manufacturers and suppliers, customers, case of collection contract or off-takers, multilateral agencies, and export credit agencies, lenders, who are the banks, bond issuers, etc., insurance companies. Risk allocation methodology. First, there's risk identification as a step, analysis of the triggering events and their probability of occurrence, contractual allocation of risk between the SPC and the public partner, risk mitigation, coverage and allocation measures between the private partners forming the SPC, creation of the risk allocation matrix. The issues of private sector participation can also be seen as overall typology of the risk of a PPP project. Here, the risks are seen as technical risk, mastery of the design, construction, production, and operation process. Economic risk of the project, endogenous, disadequacy of the product stroke bucket pair, performance and profitability of the project, social constraints, and exogenous macroeconomic risk of exchange rates and inflation. Legal risk, legislative framework of the country and contractual environment of the project. Political risk, country experience and specific project comments. The question of sharing the traffic risk in transportation projects. Ports and airport, risk sharing between public partners and SPC depending on the competitive situation of the service. Urban transport, sharing methods depending on the level of social acceptability of tariffs with regard to investment costs. Rail transport, different sharing methods depending on passenger transport or goods. Toll highways, evaluation of the time value and social acceptability of tariffs. Fictitious toll motorways allows to avoid many problems that but contrary to the user pay principle. Case of projects greenfield with low traffic, transfer of risks to public authorities. There are no standard solutions applicable to all projects. Need for a case-by-case analysis. Principles to be taken in terms of analysis and risk management. One, the private partner will accept to bear the risk that it can manage. Here, performance and management, technical risk, which is the construction and operation, interest rate risk, but must be protected against other risks, even if it can partially manage them. Political, unilateral termination of the contract by the public partner, change of legislation, etc. Indexation risk, currency, inflation, etc. Risk of modification of prices. Certain risks must be shared on a case-by-case basis, especially in the transport sector, traffic risk, risk exchange. The financial engineering of a project, of a PPP project. Financial restructuring ad hoc. This is the restructuring of public contributions outside the scope of the project company, structuring of equity and quasi-equity, structuring of financial debt. The implementation of financial risk management instruments adopted, risk of change, interest rate risk, counterparty and credit risk, political risk. Regulatory engineering of a PPP project. This is a definition of regulation. Processing, combing. One, setting the rules of the game and objective. Two, monitoring compliance with commitment. And three, incentives for performance. The different types of regulations. Economic regulation, this is a regulation of competition. Technical regulation, this is a compliance with the technical standard in force plus regulation of the quality of service. We speak of performance regulation. Financial regulation. The regulation of public infrastructure service integrates interests, which are not necessarily taken into account by the simple operation of the laws of the market. Indeed, if the market is efficient, in this sense, if the play of competition is sufficient, it is up to it to fully assume the role of regulator of activity through the free play of supply and demand. The control of the conditions of exercise of public service by a public body. In this sense, guarantor of the general interest turns out to be necessary to, one, remedy the insufficiencies of the market, and two, combine the priority antagonistic interests, the various economic players concerned, including customers. What is regulation? Regulation equals to incentive to performance. Here, setting the pricing policy, quality of service control, competition control, entry stroke exit, competitive behavior, protection of users through clients through consumers, arbitrate disputes. These are all considered performance incentive mechanisms. Then it takes us to the legal instrument, which is via institutional and regulatory framework. Here, rules defined in laws, decrees, and contracts, establishment of procedures, legitimate, competent, and independent institutions, which will also lead us to recreate incentive mechanisms similar to those existing in a competitive market, and then two, to influence on the quality of the services provided and on the behavior of users. Objective, functions, and tasks of regulations. This has to do with financial sustainability, allocative efficiency, productive efficiency, equity. This leads us to objectives. Then we have the rates, setting regulations of the quality of service, control of competition, protection of users, arbitration of disputes. This will lead us to functions. Then gather information and data, controlling the implementation of existing regulations, set the rules, justify decisions. This will lead us to tax. So in objectives, functions, and tax regulation, the following procedures must always be put into consideration. Under financial regulations, we have gathering of information and data, updated and project amounts of fees, revenues, and costs, willingness to pay different levels of service delivery, Then we go to monitor the applications of existing rules, monitor the application of financial accounts regulation, ensure that the correct rate levels are charged existing ones. Then the determination of the rules. Here we have revised rates, indices and rate base, changes in rate structure and payment methods. Then enforcing the decision, which is the last on this part, make pricing adjustment based on performance criteria, apply penalties. The technical regulations will be that current level of service, conducting technical studies. When we now go to monitor the application of existing rules, compliance with service levels, coverage of initial objectives, then the determination of the rules, define and review quality standards, adapt quality standards to actual needs, demand improvement in the service quality. The economic regulations will be illegal conduct or monopolistic behavior, that is under gathering information and data. Then under the monitor the application of existing rules, we have investigation of abuse of dominance, predatory practices. Then the determination of the rules, under it we have tendering process procurement, that is still under economic regulation. Then under enforcing the decisions, we have mandate to divest monopolies on entry costs. Then another aspect to consider will be consumer protection. Gathering of information and data. Under this, we have conducting customer survey, set up a cell to record user compliance. Under monitor the application of existing rules, consumer protection will first be considered under administrative audits of procedure and systems for accessing information for clients. We have set service standard and meet consumer expectations under the determination of the rules. And then enforcing the decision under consumer protection, we have resolving conflicts between consumers and regulated companies. The issue of private sector participation for regulatory engineering of a PPP project. It's a cycle where you have the regulation by the market, which takes us to the regulation by the public. And then under this, we have the regulation of financial flow. We also have the regulation in economic terms, and then the regulation in the technical aspect. Everything consists in obtaining a balanced relationship between three objectives: guarantee the company the return on invested capital; 2, protect the interest of users; 3, encourage the operator to minimize cost while being efficient in terms of the quality of service provided. Why regulate? Because the private partner enjoys a monopoly situation. Risk of excessive tariffs are there. Risk of inadequate level and quality of services are also involved. Risk of non-compliance with contractual commitment vis-a-vis users or the government is also there. Risk of inefficient delivery of goods and services by the private partner. Failures of market mechanism. Monopoly. This is the risk of excessive tariffs, inadequate level of quality and services, non-compliance with contractual commitment, lack of efficiency. Then destructive or unproductive competition. Unsatisfactory information sharing. Here we have insufficient information to consumers, in particular health and safety, issues of equity. External effect. The environmental impact not reflected in company cost. The institutional diagram of regulations. Regulation by an independent authority stroke agency. This explains the existence of an independent regulator, which is in English, American, Australian cases. The regulation by contract. Generally, sector, policy, functions, and regulatory are confused. That's the French case. The self-regulation, characteristic model of joint ventures or mixed economic companies. This is the French and German cases, hybrid models. The advantages of a regulation model by agency. Here, it more clearly designated responsibilities. It's in existence of a single point of contact to adapt the rules. Competence center, sector knowledge, independence. The determining factor to be an effective regulator is first the legitimacy in the eyes of the main actors. It is known to users who see the regulator as an independent arbiter capable of solving their problems. Respect on the part of the political power, which regularly consults the regulator on the various sectoral problems likely to arise. Respect from private companies. That concept, that accepts its decision. Independence. Any influence or capture on the part of political authorities or companies or users. Skill. Several years of successful practice in terms of price regulation and service quality. Transparent decision to making process. Predictability of decisions. Ability to adapt practices, regulatory unforeseen events. Ability to achieve a level of competence equivalent to that of private operators during the regulatory process. In practice, on how the determining factors to be an effective regulator is said. Most regulatory agencies adhere in theory to the principles of good regulations, but in practice, those responsible for decision-making are appointed by the government and therefore have certain difficulties in acting in a perfectly independent manner. Risk or fear of being fired, difficulty recruiting ad hoc people and setting up the agency's internal operating procedures, low remuneration in relation to the hours spent. Information asymmetry. Any cooperative relationships marked by uncertainty between actors whose interests diverge. Agency relationship implicitly includes a phenomenon of information asymmetry between the principal, who is authority conceding, who does not have complete control of the conditions of exercise of the service considered, problem of adverse selection, and two, the agent concessionaire, who manages it and whose behavior is unobservable, moral hazard problem. A marked phenomena in the context of decentralized administration and concentrated operators in oligopolistic situations. Key factors for successful global PPP management. One, a project part of a reform process of the state whose objectives are clearly defined and shared by all the actors concerned. Two, a socioeconomic justification of the project and strong involvement of the public authorities during their implementation. Three, a stable macroeconomic and legal framework. Four, strong involvement in the project from public and private sponsors. Key factors for successful global PPP management. A good understanding and identification of the risks of the project, leading to a fair and balanced allocation scheme based on a general principle. Any identified risk must be borne by the one who has the best capacity to bear it. In other words, of which it is the job. Two, an adapted financial, legal, and institutional framework, making it possible to deal with any external shocks. The most important, a partnership based on a rational and accepted by all approach to solving problems during the negotiation or renegotiation of the contract. Thank you for good listening. And I'm done with this aspect of presentation, module 4.2. If you have any question in the course of my presentation or any gray area that you need clarification, feel free to make it known to me and we will see how we'll tackle it. Thank you once more for listening.